Conway's Cabal. Did you know that at one point, George Washington was almost removed from the Continental Army? The official name for this conflict is Conway's Cabal. Conway's Cabal was a loosely organized plot by a few American generals and some members of Congress to replace George Washington with Horatio Gates during the fall and winter of 1777. The War for Independence was raging on. The British Army had successfully captured Philadelphia. This made the Second Continental Congress relocate to York, Pennsylvania for the winter. The Continental Army was suffering in Valley Forge, over 80 miles away, during the same very harsh winter of 1777. About 1/3 of the soldiers died at Valley Forge due to disease, starvation, and other complications. In a letter to Comte de Broglie, Johann de Kalb, a major general in the Continental Army, said, "It is very certain that half the army is almost naked, in a great measure barefooted." During this time, George Washington was struggling to keep his army together. The acting congressmen had expectations for their generals, and George Washington was not meeting them. The Congress was losing hope for winning the War of Independence because they had already experienced so many losses. Some of the men thought it would be a good idea to replace Washington. The man who was most serious about taking Washington's position was Thomas Conway, a general under Washington. Thomas Conway was an Irishman who was educated in France and had served in its military. He joined the Continental Army as a brigadier general and served with some distinction under Washington during the Philadelphia campaign. However, many accounts say he and Washington did not get along. During the October of 1777, Thomas Conway had gone as far as to write letters to Horatio Gates and express his concerns.
He has read this letter that is from Conway to Gates, and in this letter there's a quote that basically is that Washington is a weak general.
Horatio Gates was an English-born American who had served in the French and Indian War. He moved from England to America, back to England, and finally he moved to and stayed in America. Conway believed that Horatio Gates had more experience as a general and should replace Washington. The main reason Horatio Gates was so appealing was that he had won the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga is often credited as the turning point of the war in favor of America. One of Conway's letters stated, "Heaven has been determined to save your country, or a weak general and bad counselors would have ruined it." This means that he thinks General Washington and other generals are so substandard that there must be a divine power helping America through the war. These letters were intercepted by General Washington and brought to the attention of the Second Continental Congress. some of the members of Congress agreed with Thomas Conway's proposal. At Valley Forge, Washington informed Thomas Conway that he was aware of the letter and its content.
At which point Washington actually writes a letter to Conway and very privately, very directly says, I just thought you should know what's being said.
Because he was disgraced, on November 14th, 1777, Thomas Conway turned in his letter of resignation to the Second Continental Congress. However, Congress would not accept his resignation and made him Major and Inspector General in one day. This made some of the members of Congress, including Samuel Adams, Thomas Mifflin, and Richard Henry Lee, begin to question whether Washington could lead the Americans to victory.
And, some names that we recognize. John Hancock was not a particular supporter of Washington at that time, nor was Sam Adams. Richard Henry Lee, Benjamin Rush.
A board of war was created to oversee Washington and other administrators in the Continental Army. They monitored the decisions George Washington was making. They also tracked the ways he was impacting the Continental Army. While these members questioned Washington, something else was happening. Horatio Gates was planning a dinner party at his house in York, Pennsylvania. Among the guest list was General Marquis De Lafayette, who was good friends with Washington, and by some accounts, the son he never had. Some of the congressmen thought that Lafayette was the last person they had to persuade before they could replace Washington. Then, later in the dinner, Lafayette made a toast to George Washington. While doing so, he showed the Congress that without Washington, Lafayette might stop being a part of the American cause and tell the French Parliament to stop supporting America.
And what he actually says in his diary is that he embarrassed the people that were there by making them drink to the health of the commander-in-chief.
It was then when the Second Continental Congress gave up trying to replace Washington. After this incident, Conway continued to serve with Washington at Valley Forge and reported information about Washington to the Board of War, of which he was the president. George Washington continued to lead the Continental Army and eventually won the war for independence and freedom from England in 1783. When the war ended, Thomas Conway returned to France and rejoined the French army. He served in India with the French army, then returned to France at the beginning of the French Revolution. In 1793, he was forced to flee France because of supporters to the Loyalist cause. He later died in poverty and exile. In 1789, George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States of America. To bring everything together, the main conflict of Conway's cabal was that a few generals and members of Congress doubted George Washington and aimed to have him replaced. The compromise happened when French General Lafayette made a toast to George Washington, signifying his importance. The party where he made the toast was filled with people who opposed Washington. They realized that without Washington, France could leave them as an ally and they would have no chance at defeating England. So they discontinued their attempt to replace Washington's seat as commander of the Continental Army.